The stars belong to the gods, or at least that's what the Pantheon had made the universe believe. Dr. Elias Voss had once been a loyal servant of their order, a brilliant mind allowed to exist only because his discoveries kept the Pantheon's war machines running. He had spent decades researching their so-called divine power, unraveling the mystery of their immortality. But what he found was not divinity. It was a lie. The gods were not gods at all. He ran. Now, Elias was little more than a fugitive, his face flashing across every bounty board in the sector, marked for death by the beings he once served. The Pantheon did not tolerate traitors, and they did not forgive those who challenged their dominion. The rust-stained bulkheads of his stolen frigate groaned as it slipped through the asteroid belt of the Thanax system. The ship wasn't built for stealth, but Elias knew how to move unseen. He had spent his whole career designing sensor countermeasures for the gods. Now he used that knowledge against them. His fingers danced across the console, rerouting what little power remained to the cloaking array. If the Pantheon's hunters found him now, he wouldn't stand a chance. The ship's reactor was running on fumes, its weapons barely functional. The only thing keeping him alive was the thin layer of deception, separating him from the all-seeing gaze of the gods. A low chime pulsed from the console. Incoming transmission. Elias hesitated, then opened the channel. A hologram flickered to life, an old warship bridge, dimly lit and scarred from battle. Seated at its command chair was Commander Dane Kor, leader of the Reckoners. His battle-worn face was partially shadowed, his cybernetic eye glowing faintly. The sight of him was a welcome relief. "You're late, boss." Kor's voice was rough, edged with suspicion. "I had to shake a few god slaves off my trail." Elias exhaled. "I have it, Kor. The proof. The gods aren't who they claim to be." Kor's expression remained unreadable. "We've heard that before." "Not like this." Elias leaned in. "I found the source of their power. It's not divine. It's technology, ancient technology. They don't even understand it themselves. They just control it." Kor's cybernetic fingers tapped against the armrest. "And you can shut it down." Elias hesitated. "It's not that simple. The Omega Chord is. It's not just keeping them alive. It's keeping something contained. I need time to study it. If we moved too soon, we cooled." The ship's alarms shrieked. Elias spun back to the console. His heart stopped. Pantheon warships, 6 of them. Fast. Close. No, this wasn't possible. He had been careful. How did they find him? The comm line crackled. A new voice, smooth as silk, yet laced with something far deadlier. "Dr. Voss." The voice purred. "The gods do not appreciate betrayal." Elias's blood turned to ice. The tyrant of stars. The executioner of the Pantheon had found him. And there would be no escape. Elias didn't hesitate. His fingers flew across the controls, rerouting emergency power to the engines. The ship lurched, thrusters firing at full burn as he dove into the asteroid field. Chunks of rock tumbled past, slamming against the hull as he weaved between the debris. Behind him, the Pantheon warships advanced with terrifying precision. Their shimmering golden hulls cut through the void like celestial daggers, their weapons charging with divine fury. "Dr. Voss." The tyrant of stars' voice slithered through the comms again, calm, assured. "You will surrender." Elias silenced the channel. He needed to focus. A warning light flared red. Target lock detected. The Pantheon didn't fire standard weapons. Their ships carried sunfire lances, weapons that could incinerate entire cities in seconds. If even one found its mark, Elias would be reduced to cosmic dust. He yanked the controls hard, sending the ship into a stomach-wrenching barrel roll, just as a beam of searing light tore through space where he had been moments before. The asteroid beside him exploded, shrapnel scattering in all directions. Too close. Way too close. He needed a way out. Fast. Then he saw it. A gravity rift, a swirling anomaly at the edge of the asteroid belt. Unstable. unpredictable. A death sentence under normal circumstances, but right now it was the only chance he had. Elias punched in new coordinates and angled the ship toward the rift. The ship's warning systems screamed in protest, flashing red across the console. Hull integrity at critical levels. He didn't care. The warships were closing in, weapons primed for another volley. He only had seconds. A deep breath. A silent prayer, not to the gods, but to himself. Then he hit the throttle. The ship shot forward, engines howling. Gravity twisted around him, the pull of the rift dragging him in like the maw of some ancient beast. The Pantheon ships hesitated, unwilling to follow into the chaos. That hesitation was all he needed. Then, blackness. For a single, unbearable moment, there was nothing. No stars, no ship, no time. Then the universe snapped back into place. Elias' ship lurched, systems failing and restarting in rapid succession. He gritted his teeth as gravity reasserted itself, slamming him back into his seat. When he looked up, the sensors showed clear space. He was free, but barely. The ship's reactor sputtered, coolant leaking into the void. He wouldn't last long without repairs, but he had escaped, and that meant he could still reach his destination. Titan's Wake, the last stronghold of the Reckoners. Hours later, the wrecked ship drifted toward the surface of a barren, war-torn world. Titan's Wake wasn't a city. It was a fortress, a stronghold built from the scavenged bones of fallen warships. It was the last refuge for those who defied the gods. As Elias stumbled from his ship, battered and exhausted, he was met by the steel-eyed soldiers of the Reckoners, weapons raised, suspicious glances. Then, from the shadows, Commander Danekor stepped forward. The towering warrior, his armor scarred from 100 battles, eyed Elias with a mix of curiosity and calculation. "You're late," Kor said, his voice gruff. "I had complications," Elias exhaled. "But I have what you need." He pulled a battered data drive from his coat, holding it out. "This," he said, "it's how we kill the gods." Kor studied him for a long moment, then took the drive. "Then let's get started." Far above them, unnoticed in the darkness of space, a single Pantheon probe drifted, watching, recording. The gods now knew where humanity's last hope had gathered, and they would come. Titan's Wake was always bracing for war. The last stronghold of the Reckoners stood defiant on the lifeless rock of Eros 9, hidden beneath storms of ionized dust that scrambled long-range sensors. Scavenged Pantheon warships formed an orbital defense ring, their stolen weapons aimed at the void. It wasn't much, but it had held. Until now. In the war chamber deep beneath the surface, Elias Voss watched as his stolen data played across a flickering holo display. The others in the room, seasoned warriors, exiled scientists, and hardened rebels, studied the screen in grim silence. At the center of the display, a single construct pulsed with an eerie artificial glow, the Omega Core. "This is the source of their power," Elias said, his voice unwavering. "Every so-called god, every immortal enforcer of the Pantheon, they all draw their strength from this machine." Commander Danekor folded his arms, his cybernetic eye flickered, scanning the schematics with cold precision. "You're telling me this thing made them what they are?" Elias hesitated. "No, it didn't create them." He zoomed in, revealing ancient glyphs that predated even humanity's first steps into space. "It's been running far longer than they have. They found it, and they used it." A murmur spread through the room. "They've been lying since the beginning," one of the Reckoners muttered. Elias nodded. "The gods didn't ascend. They stole their divinity." Kor clenched his jaw. "And you're sure we can shut it down?" Elias adjusted the display. "There's a control mechanism, a failsafe. But there's a problem." "There always is," Kor muttered. Elias zoomed out, revealing the Obsidian Rift, a graveyard of shattered planets on the galaxy's edge. The Omega Core isn't on any world we know. It's here. He pointed to the rift, where even Pantheon ships dared not travel. The rift is death, said Lyra Vex, Core's second-in-command. Ships that enter don't come out. Elias met her gaze, because the Pantheon doesn't want them to. Silence hung in the room. Then Core slammed his fist on the table. Then that's where we're going. Lyra stiffened. We don't have the forces for a suicide run, Dane. We don't need an army, Elias said. We just need to get inside. Before Lyra could argue, alarms blared through the base. Red lights flashed, and a deep voice rang through the intercom. Pantheon warships inbound. Multiple signatures, moving fast. Elias' stomach dropped. They found us, Core growled. He rushed to the command console as tactical displays came online. 10 warships, then 20, then 30. The Pantheon had sent a fleet, and leading them, at the head of the formation, was a single black warship, its hull marked with the insignia of a single star wreathed in flame. Elias went cold. The Tyrant of Stars was here. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Core turned to Lyra. Evacuation order, he said. Now. Lyra nodded and ran from the room, barking orders into her comms. Core turned back to Elias. Tell me we can still do this. Elias clenched his fists. We can, but we have to leave now. Core nodded once, then slammed the alarm override. All forces, abandon Titan's wake. Get to the ships. As Elias ran toward the hangars, the first explosions rocked the base. The Reckoners were out of time. The first Sunfire lance struck the outer defense ring, shattering a stolen Pantheon battleship in a single blast. Fiery debris rained down upon Titan's wake as alarms blared across the stronghold. Elias Voss sprinted through the chaos of the war-torn corridors. The once imposing fortress trembled under the sheer power of the gods. Soldiers, engineers, and civilians rushed toward the hangars, dodging falling metal beams and bursts of steam as the structure collapsed around them. Over the base's comms, Commander Danecore barked orders. All ships launch immediately. Get to the rift. We can't win this fight, only survive it. Elias wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for war. But right now, that didn't matter. He had one job: get to the Reckoner fleet before Titan's wake was nothing but dust. The enemy had arrived in force. Dozens of Pantheon warships now filled the skies, their golden hulls gleaming like false divinity. Their weapons rained down, obliterating everything in their path. Elias turned a corner just as a shockwave from a missile blast sent him flying. He slammed against the bulkhead, his ears ringing, his vision swimming. Through the smoke, a figure emerged, a Pantheon war priest. The warrior was clad in shimmering obsidian armor, his face hidden behind a gilded mask. He raised his weapon, a plasma glaive, pulsing with energy. Elias scrambled backward, reaching for a discarded pulse pistol. The war priest lunged. Before the killing blow could land, a gunshot cracked through the corridor. The war priest staggered, a hole blasted through his helmet. He collapsed in a heap, his weapon clattering to the floor. Elias looked up to see Lyra Vex lowering her sidearm. "You're too slow, scientist," she said, yanking him to his feet. "Move." Together, they ran toward the hangar bay, dodging enemy fire as the last of the Reckoners launched their ships. By the time they reached the main bay, half the fleet was gone. Fighters and transports rocketed toward the sky, weaving between enemy warships. Core's voice crackled over their comms. "Last wave. Get aboard now. We're pulling out." Elias spotted their escape, a retrofit destroyer, its engines already firing up. But as they sprinted toward the ramp, a shadow loomed overhead. A black warship descended from the heavens, its hull wreathed in dark energy. The air itself seemed to tremble as its landing thrusters kicked up a storm of dust and fire. And then he stepped out. The Tyrant of Stars, a towering figure clad in black and gold armor, his face hidden behind a crimson mask. In his right hand, he held a blade of pure void energy, humming with restrained power. Elias froze. This wasn't just another enforcer. This was the Pantheon's executioner, the slayer of entire worlds. The tyrant's voice was calm, measured. "Run, little mortals." Then he raised his hand, and a wave of dark energy exploded outward, tearing through the battlefield. The shockwave ripped apart nearby fighters, sending bodies and wreckage flying. Elias barely managed to throw himself behind cover. Lyra wasn't fast enough. The force of the blast sent her sprawling, slamming her into a pile of wreckage. The tyrant stepped forward, his burning gaze locking onto Elias. "You carry knowledge not meant for lesser beings." His voice was like a funeral bell. "Surrender it. Now." Elias clenched his fists. The Omega Core. The truth. The one thing the Pantheon feared. Core's voice roared over the comms. "Elias, get aboard now." Elias had seconds to decide. Lyra groaned, struggling to move. She wasn't going to make it alone. The tyrant's blade ignited. Elias had to choose: save himself or go back for her. And in that moment, as the gods closed in, he made his decision. Elias moved. His body screamed in protest, but his mind was clear. Lyra wasn't dying here. He dashed across the burning wreckage, ignoring the searing heat as he reached her. She was barely conscious, blood running from a gash on her forehead. The Tyrant of Stars watched in eerie silence, his void blade humming with lethal energy. "Foolish." His voice was calm, as if Elias' actions were beneath his notice. The executioner raised a hand, dark energy swirling around his palm, ready to erase them both from existence. Elias grabbed Lyra and pulled her against him. No time for hesitation. His free hand flew to his belt, yanking out a gravity charge, a stolen Pantheon device, meant for demolition. One press, and it would collapse the space around them for a few seconds. Not enough to kill the tyrant, but enough to make an escape. He slammed the activation switch. Boom! The air shattered. The force of the gravitational distortion sent Elias and Lyra flying backward, tumbling toward the waiting ship. The tyrant staggered, his armor screeching under the weight of the collapsing space. Elias barely registered Core's voice roaring through the comms. "Voss, get your ass in here." His feet hit the ship's ramp hard. Strong hands hauled him and Lyra aboard, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the bay doors slammed shut. The ship's engines roared, lifting off just as the landing zone was engulfed in fire. Elias lay there, gasping for breath, the ship shaking as it ascended. Around him, Reckoner soldiers were shouting, but it was all distant noise. Then Core was there, looming over him. "Tell me you got it," he growled. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the data drive. Core exhaled, shaking his head. "You crazy bastard." Elias forced a smile. "You knew that already." The ship rattled violently, the hull screaming as enemy fire slammed against their shields. "They're not letting us go," a pilot called from the cockpit. Pantheon warships in pursuit. Elias struggled to his feet, dragging Lyra with him. She groaned but gave him a weak nod. "She'd make it." Core turned to the crew. "Full burn to the rift." Now, the ship's thrusters ignited, pushing them toward the obsidian rift. Behind them, Pantheon warships gave chase, faster, more powerful, and carrying the wrath of the so-called gods. But the Reckoners weren't stopping. Elias staggered to the bridge, watching as the rift loomed ahead. A swirling abyss of collapsed space, a graveyard of forgotten worlds. The Tyrant of Stars was not far behind. A cold certainty settled over Elias. They were going into the rift. There was no coming back. But if the Omega Core was truly inside, then this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The obsidian rift loomed ahead, a churning abyss where the laws of physics frayed and twisted. Space itself seemed to ripple, the shattered remains of ancient worlds caught in its endless gravitational pull. Elias Voss gripped the edge of the ship's console, staring into the unknown. Are we seriously doing this? The pilot, Rennick, muttered, hands tight on the controls. We don't have a choice, Commander Danecore said, his voice like steel. Full burn. Now. The Reckoner ship surged forward, engines howling as it barreled toward the rift. Behind them, Pantheon warships closed in, golden lances of energy tearing through space. A shockwave rocked the ship as a blast grazed the shields. Sparks rained from overhead panels. They're getting range on us. Lyra Vex called out, gripping her shoulder where a wound still bled from the battle at Titan's wake. Elias stared at the tactical display. The Tyrant of Stars was there, his black warship moving with relentless precision. He wasn't just following. He was hunting. Rennick cursed. They're trying to push us away from the rift. Core's cybernetic eye flickered. Then we pushed back. The Reckoner fleet, battered but defiant, opened fire. Missiles streaked toward the enemy, plasma cannons igniting the void. One of the Pantheon cruisers took a direct hit. Its shields flickered, then collapsed in a fiery explosion. For a moment, Elias thought they had a chance. Then the Tyrant's warship fired. A wave of pure darkness erupted from its hull, twisting toward them like a living entity. It swallowed an entire Reckoner gunship in an instant, the vessel crumbling into nothingness. Elias' blood ran cold. That's not a weapon, he whispered. That's something else. Core clenched his jaw. That's why we need to get inside that rift. Now. A blinding light engulfed the bridge as the ship plunged into the rift. The moment they crossed the threshold, everything changed. The ship lurched violently, metal groaning as gravitational forces twisted around them. The stars vanished, replaced by a swirling void of shifting colors. Time itself seemed to stretch and fracture. The alarms screamed, warnings flashing across the monitors. Engines are failing, Rennick shouted. Elias' mind reeled as he stared out the viewport. Shapes moved in the darkness. Structures. Ruins. Then he saw it. At the center of the rift, suspended above the wreckage of 1,000 dead civilizations, was a colossal machine. The Omega Core. It pulsed with an eerie rhythmic glow, ancient, mechanical, and alive. Elias felt a chill crawl down his spine. The Pantheon hadn't built this. They had found it. And now Elias was certain. This was the source of their power. Then Rennick swore. Incoming. The Tyrant's warship was right behind them. He had followed them into the abyss. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Omega Core loomed before them, its colossal frame pulsing like the heartbeat of a dead god. It was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. A machine older than civilization itself, forged in an era lost to time. But there was no time to marvel. The Tyrant of Stars was here. His black warship emerged from the rift's swirling chaos, its dark hull shimmering with unnatural energy. The void itself seemed to bend around it, as if reality was recoiling from his presence. The Reckoner ship lurched, taking a direct hit from a void lance fired from the Tyrant's vessel. His shields shattered, and warning klaxons screamed through the bridge. We're out of time. Rennick yelled, fighting to keep the ship steady. We either land on that thing or we die out here. Take us in. Core barked. The ship dove toward the Omega Core, weaving through the ruins of shattered warships and broken celestial debris. Pantheon fighters streaked past, firing relentlessly. Elias gritted his teeth. They were so close, but the Tyrant wasn't letting them go. Then the boarding torpedoes hit. The ship shuddered as black-armored Pantheon warpriests breached the hull, their arrival marked by a storm of gunfire. Lyra Vex was the first to react, spinning and blasting the first warpriest that emerged from the breach. The corridor erupted into chaos. Flashes of plasma fire, the screams of dying soldiers, the clash of steel against steel. Elias ducked behind cover as a warpriest's blade tore through the air inches from his head. He pulled out his stolen pulse pistol and fired. The shot hit home, and the warpriest crumpled. Kor and his reckoners fought with brutal efficiency, but more Pantheon forces poured in. And then he arrived. The Tyrant of Stars stepped through the breach, his void blade igniting with a deafening hum. Everyone froze. The battlefield went silent as he took slow, deliberate steps forward, his crimson mask glowing with an unnatural light. Kor raised his rifle. The Tyrant moved too fast. A single blurred motion, and Kor was slammed into the bulkhead, his weapon shattered by an unseen force. He hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. The Tyrant turned to Elias. "You were never meant to see this place." His voice echoed with an ancient power. "You are nothing. And now, you are dust." He swung his blade. Elias barely dodged, rolling across the floor as the Tyrant's weapon sliced through the metal hull like paper. Then he saw it, the control relay. A panel near the core's entrance, covered in ancient glyphs. If Elias could reach it, he could shut the Omega core down. But the Tyrant saw his gaze and understood. He raised his hand, summoning a vortex of dark energy, ready to erase Elias from existence. Lyra, bloodied and barely standing, lunged. Her knife slammed into the Tyrant's side. For the first time, he staggered. It was a small opening, but it was enough. Elias ran. His feet hit the platform, his fingers flying across the control panel. The Omega core's hum changed. And then, it began to shut down. The Pantheon's power source was failing, and the gods were about to fall. The Omega core shuddered as its ancient systems faltered. Lights flickered, the air trembled, and reality itself seemed to bend. The power that had sustained the Pantheon for eons was collapsing, and they knew it. The Tyrant of Stars let out a low, guttural growl, his mask flickering with unstable energy. He ripped Lyra's knife from his side, black mist seeping from the wound instead of blood. Elias didn't stop. His fingers flew across the controls, deciphering the ancient interface. The Omega core wasn't just a power source. It was a weapon, a relic from a time before the Pantheon, before humanity, before anything that now lived. And he had just turned it against its masters. The Tyrant lunged. Elias barely dodged, rolling as the void blade cut through the console where he had just been standing. Sparks erupted, and the entire core rumbled. Lyra, staggering but determined, raised her sidearm. She fired. The shot slammed into the Tyrant's armor, barely slowing him down. He turned to her, hand raised. And then Kor tackled him. The commander of the Reckoners, battered but unbroken, drove the Tyrant back, slamming a shock charge into his chest. The detonation sent them both crashing into the lower deck. Elias turned back to the controls. The final sequence was almost complete. The Omega core surged, its dying systems activating one final protocol. Across the rift, Pantheon warships faltered. Their once indestructible hulls began to fracture, their golden light flickering out. The gods were failing. The Reckoner fleet, beaten and outnumbered, suddenly found themselves on even ground. For the first time in history, humanity could win. Elias pressed the final command. The Omega core detonated. A shockwave of raw energy erupted from the station, a blast that didn't just destroy, it unmade. The Pantheon's power, their technology, their divine authority, all of it was erased in an instant. The Tyrant of Stars let out a final enraged roar, then vanished into the void. The Reckoner's ship was torn away from the collapsing core, its engines barely holding as they escaped into the rift's edge. Behind them, the Pantheon's fleet was pulled apart, their ships dissolving into nothingness. The false gods who had ruled the galaxy for millennia were gone. The rift sealed itself, burying the Omega core's remains forever. For the first time, in a universe that had long been controlled by tyrants masquerading as deities, humanity was free. The Reckoner survivors sat in stunned silence aboard their battered vessel, watching as the stars returned to normal. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He looked at Kor, at Lyra, at the remnants of their people. They had won, and now the galaxy belonged to them.